Well, we're everything but organized around here. I will be preaching on a subject that you have some information about already, and so I don't have any excuse for being long necessarily. Yeah, I hope. No, Farrell, thank you. That actually does save me some time. And I am going to talk about the meanings of incarnation, and that'll be something that I want to talk about in a different way, probably to some degree. I want to tie it to some degree with some articles of literature. One of the things that I think you need to think about in talking about why the incarnation, why is it that God Himself, and I say Himself because God, when Jesus says, when Paul writes, and Jesus is indicated as being of the very, some translations will say form, but the better Greek word here, interpretation, is the word essence. He was in essence God, and He gave that up. We'll read that text in Philippians. He came here out of a number of reasons, I think. But one, if you think about it, God created us. We are His creation. We are His children. If you think about it, how do you treat your children? If I can stand in front of my students when I taught at Pepperdine and say to them, there is nothing you can do that I won't still care for you, that I still won't love you, that I still won't work with you, that I want you to understand that that's the commitment I'm making to you. You hang in there. But if you look at what God is doing and what we do with our own children, we all make mistakes. Maybe you were a perfect child. I wasn't. And yet my parents loved me. People ask me, well, why does God love us? And the answer is easy. Because He loves us. I know that sounds like it's not genuine, but He loves us because He created us, because He gave us life, and because He's committed to loving us. So if you want to think about this, there's a great author that probably very few people know today, in large measure, and no, even I wasn't born then, but she was born in something like 1893. I believe that's the exact year she was born. And she became a writer of novels in the early 19th century. And later, she began to write detective stories, one of the very first British women to write detective stories. And she created this character who was a royal person. He was Sir Peter Wimsey. And she wrote these books and just poured into him the kind of man she wanted to meet and to marry. She grew to love her own character. And so she wrote herself into the story, into the book, and described herself with a different name. And Sir Peter Wimsey married her. How's that relevant to what we're talking about? God has put Himself in our story. God who loves us, who created us, God came down in the form of Jesus Christ to love us and to be with us. Why? Because He loves us. He loved us from the beginning. He loved us in creating us. He loved us for being in His very nature or form. So when we think about Christmas and we think about the incarnation, I think one of the most important factors involved in that is God came into our lives in a literal way with Jesus and lived with us in a human body, in human flesh, going through the birth canal of a little peasant girl. I know I bring this up every Christmas, but stop and think about it. In all likelihood, We're talking about a girl in the range of 16 years old. And it takes an angel from heaven to convince her of what's going to happen. And then, thankfully, what a wonderful man has been brought out. Her husband, Joseph, says, no, I'm not going to, I'll put you away privately. But he gets a vision from heaven itself, from an angel speaking to him. And he does everything to protect her and love that child just as the children they will have later. God came into our story to love us, to care for us, to identify with us, to be here for us. And that's a form of Christianity that I think no other religion on the face of the earth comes close to even connecting in message to human beings in the way that God coming himself into our lives, into our world, into our flesh. How can we not but understand the love of God? What I think that also the incarnation says something else that's really important. Salvation is by grace. He came not because he had to. He came not in any way to try to convince us that we were evil and terrible. He knew who we were. God came because he loves us. And he came and offers himself in the form of Jesus, the Son of God, a part of the Godhead. He offers himself on the cross, dies, and he comes for that purpose. You remember the conversation he's having with his Father in heaven, with God Almighty, his Father. And he says, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. The cup of death, the cup of crucifixion, the cup of separation from God. You ever thought about why the temple veil, why the darkness before the temple veil is so torn asunder, separating the two? Why that moment of darkness on the cross? Some theologians believe, in our own movement, some theologians believe that it's because at the point all the sins of all mankind for all time is laid on Jesus, God literally can't look upon him, and the earth becomes darkened. Jesus went beyond even what his nature wanted to do in living and in dying. Again, because they know no other way. For there to be redemption. You can't redeem yourself totally by just turning around and being good. Why? Because we're never really consistent at it, are we? Remember, John tells us in 1 John in his writing that, and he's talking, remember, he says, I write to this as though you're my dear children in the faith. They're Christians. And what does he say? He says, if you say you're without sin, you're a liar and the truth is not in you. So walking in the light as Jesus is in the light, walking in the footsteps of Jesus is not overcoming the fact that we are human beings. Do you know why you do everything you do? I don't. I mean, do you really get out of bed some morning and want to be a total grouch? And yet you are occasionally, right? I mean, if you're one of those people that get out of bed every morning and you got this sweet smile on your face and you're sweet to the world, you make me a little sick. I don't know. Get real. I mean, some days you just don't feel good. Some days you don't act as well as you should. Some days Lord, I need your redemption. I need your redeeming. I need your forgiveness. I need the forgiveness of others. I need your love. God incarnate comes to demonstrate the grace of God and the depth of the love of God. And that's so very important. I am going to cut this a little short because you've been patient. I want to say there's another story that I like a lot, that I believe that the author, and again, I'm showing my age, I guess, but I'm going back to an author who wrote in the 1800s. Early 1800s at that. And no, I don't go back that far. But this author wrote an article that was published in a journal, in a magazine that was circulated on the prairies and all that stuff. It's called The Luck of Roaring Camp. I don't know if you've ever heard that story or not. You're Californians, so I thought maybe they taught it in your school. It was written as a California story. But I'm going to take poetic license with it and make it a little bit different than it is, although it's mostly very, very important to stay with. It's about a 4-page article. I brought a few copies if anybody wants to have a copy of it later. But in Roaring Camp was one of those gold mining camps where they go out and dig some, and they go into the streams and they pan for gold. And they were successful occasionally. But Roaring Camp was in the middle of nowhere. I don't know where Red Dog is, California, if it still exists. But there was a Red Dog, California then. That was 40 miles away. They were in the foothills of the mountains, and they were miners, right? Or not digging, but they were in dirty clothes all the time. In that camp, there were roughly 100 men. And there was one woman, Cherokee gal. And Cherokee, the only woman in the camp, with these filthy, dirty men who sometimes had money, but usually made that 40-mile trip to probably drink away a lot of it. She was with child. I doubt that she knew who the father was. She was a sinful woman. And the day came when the camp was kind of excited. She was giving birth. The Cherokee gal died in childbirth. And so they're left with a little baby boy. 99 men and one little baby boy. Rough, crude men who were filthy dirty themselves. Their camps were dirty, and they got a little baby boy. So they got together, and believe it or not, unanimously they said, no, we're not going to take her to Red Dog because that's just a place where people buy booze, and it's not a place for a child. So they decided they would adopt the little baby boy. And they named him David Luck. He was the Luck of Roaring Camp. And they actually helped him to, and you asked about, well, let me cover the food. I wasn't sure I could use the word because the word was in that song. I can say that they had what the Bible calls an ass. That it would give milk. It was a female. And they were able to give milk to the baby. And they said in a somewhat miraculous way, they almost said it was of God, but it was perhaps also the mountain, fresh air, and climate, and they didn't know. But that baby survived. But what I want to tell you about is those filthy, dirty men raising that baby. They put it at first in just one of their buckets and put a few rags in there. And they said, that doesn't quite look, that baby's really handsome. You know, and so they basically decided they were going to make that 40-mile trip, and they bought a crib. And they brought that crib back, and they said, well, it's still not good enough. They went back again, and they bought some silk to line it with some padding, and they began to care for the baby in very minute ways. But they also started to say, this place is really filthy. We can't have this for a baby. So they began to clean up the place. And they began to say, you get drunk and you go crazy over here. We're not going to have you doing that around a baby. Now, because I promised a little brevity, I'm not going to do that so far as I normally go to talk about everything that was done was because that baby changed everything. And I think even before Jesus Christ goes on being the teacher and the person who is going throughout the countryside to begin to lay really the foundation for his own death, and to lay the foundation for why he has come and that he's come for us. That even from the time he was a baby, he changed everything. It happens that the author that I was talking about, who wrote the Mysteries, Sayer, wrote a book also that was called The Man Born to be King. And it is about Jesus. And it is about the influence that he would have on his life, that brief life, where if you think about adulthood, that it's somewhere around that 20-year-old age when you first have any credibility at all, that he lasts less than 10 years probably, where he's not at least in prison and being beaten and everything else, and then crucified. All because, again, of the fact that God loves us with the kind of love that uses a Hebrew word that I've mentioned before. It is transliterated either H-E-S-E-D or C-H-E-S-E-D because of the way the Hebrew pronounces chesed or chesed. That it is a kind of love that the incarnation proves beyond a doubt. It is a kind of love that says, I will love you with a feverish pitch of devotion. You'll kick dirt in my face. You will betray me. You will even kill the Messiah. And I will love you. It says so much about the depth of the grace of God and why I think all of us kind of celebrate the birth of Jesus and the life of Jesus. Let's face it, we do at Christmas talk more about Jesus than we do the rest of the year in many cases. And in this time, yes, it's corrupted by commercialism and all this stuff, the holiday itself, but from the standpoint of what we hear in the songs we sing, in the sermons that are preached, in the services that are held, from candlelight services to whatever kind of services, we are celebrating that Jesus Christ emptied himself and came here to live among us, to identify with us, but to identify in a way no other being in the history of mankind has ever been. He is both God and man. And it is as God and man, as God incarnate and man of flesh, that he can die on the cross and represent salvation for all humankind through the death of the one man who lived according to the law and grace of God. We should celebrate this season with the joy of the Lord, knowing that we are called to identify with that. I'm not going to read all of the text to you. You know it. It takes a little time to do that. It's in Philippians, the 2nd chapter, though, if you want to look at it. That's the text where the text says that he is of the very essence God, but he emptied himself of the glory of being God. He emptied himself to become incarnate in flesh, in human form, incarnate through that birth canal of a little peasant girl in the middle of nowhere. Doing all that to say to us, Paul does. Paul says it to this, be incarnated. Oh, not in the sense that you were ever God and you become it. No, the opposite. Let the Spirit of Jesus Christ himself indwell you. May you humble yourself and be the kind of servant that Jesus Christ was. May you live in a way that literally lives out the life of Christ, because we are walking in the light of his word, in the light of his presence, in the light of who he is. So the next time you go by poor people and you don't know what the right thing is to do, I'm not suggesting you give a lot of money to people who are going to go probably invested in what goes into their arms or in a bottle or whatever. But our God didn't come to the Kennedy family. Our God didn't come to the wealthiest men and women on the earth. God came incarnate and went to the poorest of the poor. Remember that Mary and Joseph couldn't afford. They were poor enough that they were excused under the old law. They were excused from even bringing a lamb. They brought 2 doves. They're among the poorest of the poor. Jesus just didn't come to those of us who are successful. In fact, sometimes that success overcomes our commitment to loving other people, to living the life of Jesus, and in touching this community. So the incarnation means that we too are called to let the Spirit of the Lord Jesus live in and through us, and be as graceful, as sacrificing, as kind, as loving as Jesus. Will we fail at times? Yes. But isn't that our goal? So when we stand to sing the song that Scott's chosen here for our closing song, then basically let's sing it with just a little contemplation in our own mind. How can I let the very Spirit of Jesus Christ indwell me more effectively in loving other people, in giving my gifts to other people? I think that'll be a great way to celebrate Christmas. Think about it as we stand and sing.